Welcome, Jeremy Emmons de Purpose.
Okay, great. Well, hello. It's terrific to be here. Thanks so much for listening. I want to talk to you guys today about how power in the world is shifting and what the implications of that are for government, for international organizations, and for many other actors in this new world. And I want to start by telling you a story that is just a little vignette about how power is changing. This is an 11-year-old girl in Rio called Bia. And Bia goes to a terrific public school in Rio that in 2013 was about to be demolished to make way for an Olympic parking lot. Now, as you may know, there's a lot of development happening, billions of dollars flooding in to Rio for the Olympics. And a lot of that development is not particularly accountable or responsive to the communities that it serves. So Bia decides that she wants to start a campaign to save her school from demolition, which was expected in a matter of days. So she used a tool created by an organization called Rio, which is a civic participation and anti-corruption organization in Rio that the organization that I run, Purpose, incubated. And this tool means pressure cooker in Portuguese. And she started a campaign, and people from all over Rio started chiming in and supporting her campaign to save the school. Now, when Rio saw that this campaign was getting some momentum, it decided to try to turn this into what we call in the world of movement building an iconic impact story. A story that would become a beacon and that would encapsulate a bigger issue and help to bring about bigger change. So what Rio did is they set a live web stream on the school, which they knew was going to be demolished, and they said, citizens of Rio, here's a camera, monitor the school, and leave a phone number, leave your mobile phone number, and become a text message guardian of this school. And as soon as somebody sees on the website that the demolition equipment has arrived, you will get a text. And with that text message, we will all gather and form a human barrier to protect the school from demolition. So this campaign really captured the imagination of Carioca, the name that, of course, Rio citizens call themselves. And it got a wave of publicity in Rio, and it really became this kind of David and Goliath battle, right, against the power of big development. And in the end, we never needed to send the human barrier in to save the school, because the mayor of Rio, who'd fiercely opposed these actions, had a change of heart. And the mayor of Rio decided that he actually wouldn't demolish the school after all. And a bigger debate was unlocked in Rio after the school was saved about what it means for communities for this development to happen. And when we won, of course, there was the obligatory Facebook graphic sharing the victory. So what does this little story mean? Well, you might say or think of it as just a story about one little girl using mobile phones in a very clever way. But actually, I think the agency, that sense of agency that you see in a young girl in Brazil without access to power like Bia, tells a bigger story about how power in the world is shifting. So about a year and a half ago, I got together with a colleague, Henry Timms, who's also involved in these new forms of mobilization and movement building. And we got thinking about the structural characteristics of the new models that were emerging in politics, in business, in education, in media, these bottom-up, peer-based, mass participatory models. And so we wrote an article in Harvard Business Review that was published in the December 2014 issue. And I want to share with you the sort of framework that we wrote up in that article and use it as a way to talk about some of these dynamics. So old power meet new power. So, new power is all around us. We see it in the marked increase in political dissent and in political insurgency all over the world, right? You see it in Europe with insurgent folks like Beppe Grillo and Podemos without a formal political apparatus, using these sideways digital tools to kind of usurp and disrupt traditional political actors. And you, of course, see it in these new open source movements cropping up all over the world. In the US, the most recent manifestation is Black Lives Matter. You see it in the economy with models like Airbnb. Now, Airbnb doesn't own a single square foot of real estate, and yet it's now become the largest source of temporary accommodation in the world. It's eclipsed all of the big hotel groups in terms of the number of rooms that they provide. And they've done this by basically creating a very smart, peer-based model that just allows people to disintermediate the hotel and coordinate amongst themselves to share accommodation. You see it even now emerging in economic models in finance, in currencies. There are models emerging that I think very soon will disrupt and disintermediate the kind of most old power of old power institutions, the bank. And so, just thinking about this difference between old and new power, I think a good way to think about the difference is that the way you exercised power in the 20th century, right, old power, was held like a currency. This is the traditional way in which power has been exercised. The more of it you had, the more powerful you were. It was something that you hoarded, right? It was something that you kept to yourself. New power is exercised quite differently. New power is not most powerful when you hoard it. It's most powerful when you channel it. It's most powerful when it's something that you know how to channel so that it flows like water or electricity. Old power is held by a few. These models are based on exclusivity, on resource consolidation. New power is made by many. These models would be nothing. They would be empty vessels were it not for their crowds. Facebook would be meaningless and powerless without the billions of people who participate in it. Old power is based on the principle of download, right? Read this newspaper, buy this pair of shoes. That's the underlying principle. New power is based on upload. The models are based on what the crowds that constitute them can provide to make them powerful. So in the HBR piece, we sort of mapped the behaviors that these new models are run on. And some of these models are creating these multi-billion-dollar businesses, and in other cases you see them being very powerful models in media and politics. So you think of old power models as traditionally based on the behavior of consumption. That's the enabling behavior. What we're asked to do in an old power model is comply and consume. Now in these new power models, you see these other behaviors emerging. You see a Facebook based on the behavior of sharing. You see many other media platforms based on the behavior of shaping, remixing, adapting other people's ideas. You've got this new emerging form of crowdfunding, which is not traditional philanthropy and it's not consumption. It's a kind of endorsement with money. And this is proliferating now as a way to fund businesses, to fund cultural projects, to fund many kinds of things. You see these communities where people are delivering their own real assets in the context of a peer community. That's what a host on Airbnb does, for example. And you see models in which the users, the members of the network, effectively co-own the network. You see that in virtual currency models. You see that to some extent in models like Wikipedia. So here are a few things that new power is not, by way of clarification. New power is not your Facebook page. In fact, there are many ways in which people are exercising and using these new tools, right, in very old power ways, right? Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, he has a Facebook page. That does not mean he has understood or is employing the power of participation, right? We had a lot of fun running a campaign against Facebook when we discovered that they were actually taking ad revenue from Assad. I think some American political naivety. And we pointed out that maybe a bad idea to take money from a man who'd killed hundreds of thousands of his own citizens, and Facebook changed their policy pretty quickly after we mobilized the public. But the point is that you can still download using these new channels. You can treat Facebook and Twitter like press releases, and you're not fundamentally changing the way you're engaging with people. New power is also not inherently positive. Last week, I had the misfortune of going to the dentist and getting a root canal. Not as bad as it sounds, by the way. But, let me tell you, I don't want my root canal surgery to be crowdsourced, right? There are some things for which expertise and consolidation are very necessary. And more broadly and more substantively, there are many times in which these new power models don't necessarily produce better outcomes than their old power antecedents. But I think more broadly, the way to think about these new models is they're not inherently positive. They're not, by the way, as well, the inevitable victors. We see a lot of conflict and tension between new and old power in our era. You think of the tension between an Edward Snowden using his WikiLeaks methodology and an NSA. Now, Edward Snowden is the one in hiding. But we're at the beginning of a steep curve. And you think about a young person, right? Even when I grew up back in Australia, we had 5 TV channels, right? There was not much I could really do to engage with the world, even though I wanted to very badly. Whereas a kid these days growing up, a kid like Bia, could plausibly have 1 million YouTube followers. In fact, there are young people, there are teenagers with larger followings than The Economist and some of the most well-known and revered media brands. And these people can now raise money for their work. They can have enormous reach in a global market, and that actually is changing their mindsets. So in HBR, what we did was we sort of identified some of these new power values and how they contrasted to old power values. And again, you don't have to like these new power values. You just have to recognize that this is what a lot of people are beginning to believe. So you think about this across a few dimensions. You think about it on the dimension of governance, where there's this belief in networked governance. There's a move away from the managerialism and the representative governance that's represented in institutions like the one that we're in today. We said in the HBR piece, the new power crowd would not have invented the United Nations. They're more flash mob than General Assembly. And that may not be a good thing in many ways, but it's a reality in terms of the way people want to engage. There's a belief in collaboration as an end in itself. There's certainly this belief in radical transparency. So the era of gentlemen sitting behind closed doors and making agreements is over. And there's a sense in which, in the 20th century, people were card-carrying members of organizations, and they would be members for 30, 40 years. And today, young people want to affiliate very differently. They affiliate more, in fact, but that affiliation is much less enduring. It's much less robust. And that's an important factor to consider. So unfortunately, in all of these HBR pieces, you're contractually obliged to produce a 2x2 matrix. And so our 2x2 matrix was setting out these organizations along the dimensions of new power models and new power values. So here we found that Apple is actually a fascinating old power organization when you think about it. Its model is brilliant product designer in Cupertino, develops product, sells it to us, we have no role. It's a notoriously untransparent and uncollaborative company in terms of the way it operates. You see the Obama campaign, which is a classic new power model with new power values, but Obama in office is actually pretty old power. Very traditional presidency in terms of the way he's involved people. He hasn't made the presidency fundamentally more participatory. So think about where your organization maps along the dimensions that I've outlined. And ask where your organization wants to be in 5 or 10 years. So the organization I run, Purpose, is about building movements and new models that harness this new power, but that also helps old power, existing institutions, figure out how to incorporate these new models into what they do. And we create new ventures, we collaborate with big philanthropies and companies, and we build technology. So some quick advice if you're old power, and some quick advice if you're new power. And I won't, ever assume one or the other for this audience. So, the first thing if you're old power is, to really think about occupying yourself before others occupy you, right? We live in a time in which, your inner workings are much more transparent and much more vulnerable and exposed than they were. So imagine that your harshest critic is camped out in the heart of your organization. They can see your inner workings and consider whether they would say that your values and your expressed values are consistent with your behavior. You should also think about how to make what you do ownerless, right? This is a campaign called Givingtuesday that was a campaign to spread philanthropy around the world. The critical innovation of this is that there were no brands anywhere on this campaign. It was owned by nobody. And as a result, it propagated and spread all over the world and has raised more than $150 million of new money with no investment because there was no institution that was actually putting its logo on the initiative. We need to move from what you might think of as sound bites. So in the 20th century, the way people communicated was they had a message and a politician would repeat it over and over again. Whereas today, that's not actually as effective to propagate and spread ideas. You actually have to create ideas that are almost unfinished so that people can make them their own, they can adapt them. It's like you create the stem of an idea and other people adapt and propagate it. Occupy Wall Street wasn't successful in many ways, but it did this brilliantly. It created the meme, the frame, Occupy. The frame, we are the 99%. And then people started occupying everything in virtual and real ways. It was a meme that people essentially could take and make their own. We did this on the issue of climate change recently and reached 265 million people. It was a fascinating exercise in giving people the tools to own the issue of climate change rather than giving people a message that they were asked to repeat over and over again. What do you do if you're new power? Well, to come back to Occupy, I think an important lesson of the Occupy movement is that the ideological belief in participation and collaboration shouldn't come at the expense of actually getting things done, right? And so sometimes that ideological purity that we're going to make everybody participate can sometimes be at the expense of action. And sometimes you need to blend old and new power, particularly in the current context, in order to really see an idea move from a meme to concrete political and social change. You also need to think about if you have one of these new power models, you have a responsibility to essentially cultivate that model. And it's fascinating watching Uber and how it's handling its new power base, its drivers, in contrast to Airbnb. So Uber's drivers are now unionizing against Uber, which is actually very funny in a way. So they've come up and they've said, we're not happy with the way the network is treating us, and they're rising up against the platform owner. So if you have a crowd, if you have one of these new power constituencies, you have to actually invest and cultivate that. Airbnb's done this much better, and it has lovely old ladies doing its lobbying for it in the US, which is very clever for them, being a kind of a grassroots army on this. So I want to leave you with one thing. I think a lot of these new power models show real dexterity at mobilizing people digitally in new ways. But unfortunately, many of these models, like an Uber or a Facebook, are not really engaging with the problems of the least powerful. They're not using these tools to actually help the most marginalized people in the world. At Purpose, we've been working a lot on the problem of Syria and how to tell a different story using these tools about the crisis in Syria. We found a group of volunteer search and rescue workers doing heroic work in Syria, pulling people out of the rubble after the barrel bombs. And so I want to leave you with this video, which I think is an example of using these tools to engage with the problems of the least powerful. Yep. we'll cue the video, hopefully.
في أحد الأيام تعرضت منطقة الأنصاري لقصف بالبراميل المتفجرة. حصلنا نطالع العائلة الأولى والعائلة الثانية. العائلة الثالثة هي الأم والولد. هي فعلا يعني الأم كانت كثير منفعلة. عندها كثير كانت عصبية وكانت عم تصيح، يعني هي خايفة على حالها أو خايفة على ابنها. بعد الحفل الطويل صرنا نسمع صوت الولد، صوت صار يبكي الولد، صرنا نسمع صوته وكان كثير محل صعب. بعد ما وصلنا لولد هون صار الشغل كثير بده حذر، يعني هذا ولد عمره أسبوعين أو أكثر، بأي لحظة بيطب شي فوق أو بيموت أو بيختنق. هلا 12 ساعة طبعا هي ما كلمة تنقال، يعني عمل كثير حذر، يعني هي روح بدك تتعامل معها بشكل خطير جدا. يعني إنه طفل عمره أسبوعين يطب فوق برميل أو 3 سقوف ما يسيبوا شيء، يعني وكل هالضغوطات إنه هذا الطفل يطلع أقوى من البراميل وأقوى من السقوف وأقوى من كل شيء. هذا اعجازه تبارك اسمع أمه وينها؟ تعال أمك الماء شوي صليت عليه يا صالح يا الله ثواني أبيسك ثواني أنا عايز يا أخي.
زرتوا لي الولد بعد ما انقذته؟
ما عندنا وقت، قليل لهم قصف قصف قصف.
Merci, merci Jérémy, on peut l'applaudir. Peut-être vous avez une question ou deux. On a le temps pour une ou deux questions si quelqu'un dans l'Assemblée a une question. Sinon, moi j'en ai une tout de suite. Jeremy, if I may, what are you working on now? What is your next campaign?
Well, we're working very hard on the Syrian crisis and also on climate change. So I'm happy to be back in Paris in a couple of weeks for the conference. We're trying to figure out how do you create a positive narrative for the public coming out of this conference, right? Because we know what happened in Copenhagen, where there was a very negative narrative that really held the climate movement back for 5 years or more. And so we want people in the public to know that whatever happens among the politicians in Paris, that there is an unstoppable momentum to achieving a renewable energy future. So we're working on that, and we've got a whole bunch of mobilizations planned in and around Paris to help shape the public's view of what happened and to keep people engaged and inspired no matter what happens here in a few weeks' time.
How do you finance your projects?
A mixture of ways. So we work directly with clients, like an organization or an NGO or sometimes companies. We have philanthropists like Gates or Bloomberg or Soros. Folks like that fund our work, fund some of these projects that you see. And we also build technology. And so we're able to generate some revenue that way.
What was your budget for 2014? Or
that's a very
it's a good question. Huh?
I think it was about 15 million essentially when you factor in various things that we're doing. But beyond that, there's other projects outside of the core of purpose that we started that make for many, many more people. It's about 100 people within purpose, and then there's probably a couple of other 100 other people associated with different projects that we've helped to start.
Ok, est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Oui, s'il vous plaît. Un petit micro là pour madame. Merci de vous présenter.
Hello, thank you for this. I'm Shaoli Mallet. I'm French. I'm going to talk in English for you. My question is, what is the real aim behind this? And the effect, is it the disruption of the state?
Well, I mean, I think that is and isn't happening. So what you see, I think, with these new power models is they're very good at revolution. They're very good at electing an insurgent political candidate. They haven't proven very good at consolidating that power into the machinery of government. So, you saw with the Arab Spring, of course, the effectiveness of this work, these kinds of models in creating the initial disruption, but that fizzled, right? And that was not able to consolidate. So I think one of the big open questions about these models is, will they ultimately affect the existing kind of political and social superstructure rather than just kind of, puncture the edges? And I do think that as certain technologies advance, it will get easier for new forms of collaborative decision-making to emerge that may ultimately challenge institutions. But as we all know, institutions are sticky, right? They're very hard to change. It's a lot easier to disrupt than it is to fundamentally reform or change existing institutions. So I think that's an open question at this stage.
One more question over there. Yeah.
Rama Sofia Rajdi, United States Press Agency. Thank you very much for this talk and the testimony from Syria. I've got a question regarding the climate change and the COP21 you were speaking about. Yesterday, Mr. Hollande, he said with Mr. Morales, the Bolivian president, that they are working on a new economic model. So it is the trend nowadays to speak about paradigm and new models, but coming out from the politicians. What is your action plan in that way? And are you targeting the civil society or are you targeting the governments? Thank you.
I don't know what François Hollande meant by new economic models. So it's hard for me to answer the question. So yeah, I mean, I think the new economic model we're all trying to work toward is a viable way in which we get to 100% clean energy, because that's what the science tells us we need pretty quickly, probably by mid-century, as we know. So the economic challenge is, how do you scale that quickly enough? And that's partly about the price of renewables, of course, but it's also about these new, more distributed energy models. So a place like India, its best chance of leapfrogging and skipping over the coal thing is going to be trying to get solar at scale, and that will involve a bit of new power, highly distributed models, rather than ones in which you have a lot of centralization.
If I may ask, in Western societies, in India or in open countries, the new type of power you are suggesting is possible. What's happening in China or Iran, for example, where all the social networks are controlled very, very carefully and where there is a new kind of society control? Can it work also in China or in Iran?
Well, I was in China a couple of weeks ago, and it's fascinating because in China there is so much participation now. The state sanctions, there's a thing called WeChat, which has replaced the thing that was big before called Weibo. Now it's WeChat. And there's hundreds of millions of users on this thing, and they're participating like crazy. But they're only really participating by sharing videos of their cats and talking about things that the state allows them to talk about. So essentially there's a lot of economic engagement, there's a lot of cultural engagement, which is very different to China 30 years ago when none of those things were happening. And I think it feels like the state has made the strategic decision to create these participation farms, if you like, in which everybody gets to engage except on matters that threaten the political viability of the state. And sadly, I think that many people in China are buying into that trade-off because it's very engaging and entertaining and compelling to be engaged in this constant consumerism and constant social engagement. And that, I think, is taking some of the pressure off the more traditional political dissent.
Okay, merci beaucoup. Et on peut l'applaudir, quoi.
Thank you. Thanks very much.